Hello, everybody. I am Rue, also known as Joey DeSena. I am part of Clan of the Grey Wolf, Retroware TV. Also, I make web shows like 16-Bit Gems and The Way Games Work. And you are?
Hi, I'm Norman Caruso, and I do a documentary series known as The Gaming Historian.
And if you are here, there's more people than we expected, and we assume the reason is...
You may be wondering where this man is.
So Pat, for various reasons, had to skip out on coming to MAGFest a few weeks ago. Originally, he and Ian Ferguson from the Pat the NES Punk show were going to join us to talk about this. So in lieu of that, we recommend that you all tweet at him and say something about asking his opinion on Gamergate.
Oh yeah, he loves that.
So this is a talk just to let you know a little bit about preserving video games, how you can preserve video games, things to watch out for, and some of the more interesting aspects of video game preservation being done by various organizations,
Peoples
around the world. We'd like to open it up to questions at any time during the presentation. So if you have a question, just put the hand up, and we'll call on you. Yeah, so.
Questions or comments?
So first up is, why should we care? Here we have Herman Melville in a jaunty party hat.
Yeah, so we just want to talk first about other forms of media that have been lost over history. So I hope everybody knows the author Homer. Not Homer Simpson,
Go!
Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey. Okay. So he wrote a book, an epic poem before the Iliad known as Margites, and it doesn't exist anymore. We only have references to it from Aristotle. Another example, Herman Melville wrote a book based on a true story called The Isle of the Cross. Submitted it to his publisher. His publisher said, no thanks, and no one knows what happened to it. Ernest Hemingway, this is a good story, he wrote, when he served in World War I, wrote a lot of short stories, had them in a briefcase, gave them to his lover at the time.
Oh.
She got on a train, and she lost the briefcase. So he had a bunch of stories that no longer exist. No one knows where they are.
So, I mean, it makes sense. Literature's been around for thousands of years in one form or another. Surely, lost poems from Homer may not be that surprising, but the thing is that preservation of all forms of media has been a problem. This is the only surviving clip from, if it works, which it's not. Dang it. Assume that this is a moving image. It's about 16 seconds long. It's the only surviving clip from a movie called Cleopatra, made in 1917. At the time, it was the most elaborate Hollywood film ever made. It cost about $500,000 in 1917 dollars, and employed 2,000 people. But the thing is, no one paid attention. No one in the 20s or in the teens, 19-teens, really cared about preservation. They just went on to make the next big movie. And the Film Foundation, which totally sounds like a made-up organization, but is not, has estimated that about half of all American films made before 1950, and 90% of those made before 1929, are lost forever for various reasons. The film stock was very flammable, there were fires, and no one took a lot of steps to specifically preserve those films. And even television, this is probably not going to work. Nope. Here. Dang it. This is the only known clip of the first Doctor from Doctor Who regenerating. This was in 1966, I want to say. This comes from a four-part story called I think it's 4 parts, called The 10th Planet, and all we have is like this 20-second clip. That was only found years after the fact, and the BBC was notoriously bad for saving their footage for preservation later on. Also, please visit and subscribe to the BBC.
Play the Cleopatra clip. I'd actually like to see that.
Sorry, yes. And here's this is really fascinating. This is almost 100 years old. Amazing work on the costumes and a little bit of sexy look. So This is all that really exists.
Yeah, and the main reason that these institutions were throwing away these TV shows and films was there was no more commercial value for them. So they said, well, we need to clear some storage space, so let's just burn a bunch of films.
Yeah, and it was only years later that people were saying, hey, whatever happened to that old Doctor Who show? Like, oh, crap. So, and
you want to see that?
And there are still something like 90 whole episodes of Doctor Who that are missing. You know, if you're a fan of Doctor Who, I'm sure you already know about this, but that even now, it's a 50-year-old program, 51 years now, and it's, you know, you have about 90 or so episodes just missing off the face of the planet that may never be found. So it's discouraging at times.
Yeah, and it's not an old media problem. There's missing films from the 70s and 80s that we'll never see. The British Film Institute, speaking of BBC, has a 75 most wanted list. So they're still actively searching for these TV shows and movies that they have no idea where they went.
And so why is this? And how does this relate to video games? Well, this is something I completely made up. So if you find fault with it, please, feel free to let me know. But in my mind, I was thinking about it, it's like, well, there's kind of this spectrum of public interest. And yes, I know the name needs work. But essentially, if you could chart how much interest a particular piece of media has in the public consciousness, in this case, video games, red and white being very high, the warm colors meaning there's a lot of interest, people are really interested, and then the cooler colors like purple and blue, not so much. Usually, the sequence of events goes, you have something new and shiny, and oh my god, isn't it great? Everyone wants it. After a while, a few years, it becomes old. No one really cares anymore. Now's the time to buy PS3 and Xbox 360 and Wii games because they're discount binned at GameStop, right?
Clearing space.
At some point, there's an inflection point where suddenly people are going, I remember Grand Theft Auto 3. I used to play that when I was a kid. Wouldn't that be interesting to pick up again and have that and maybe play it? And at that point, something becomes retro, which is a very wide-reaching description in video games. I mean, this can go from the Atari now almost up to the PS2, where something is old, but we don't call, retro gaming is called retro gaming and not old gaming because old gaming has a bad connotation. Retro is like, oh yeah, what's the line from Wreck-It Ralph? Retro is old but cool, which is basically true.
I think everybody has their own definition of what retro is.
Yes, and like I said, you can argue it. Oops, sorry. And then in certain instances, something will become an antique. So examples of this, and an antique is like very valuable and very rare. Not always. So something new, Grand Theft Auto 5. You can get it now for new, $60 on PS4, etc., etc. Grand Theft Auto 4 is probably $10 in the bargain bin at GameStop. I just mentioned Grand Theft Auto 3. I have a friend who literally bought his girlfriend a PS2 for Christmas because she wanted to play Grand Theft Auto 3. So there you go. Retro, Mario Brothers, obviously. That's something that when it was old, we were discussing this yesterday. Super Mario Brothers 5 years ago could be had, Mario Brothers Duck Hunt specifically, could
probably
be had for maybe $1.
Yeah.
Because there's tons of them. Now, it's like $7.
$7.
Roughly.
Yeah.
On eBay to buy a copy because people want more of it and the price goes up. Not a ridiculous amount, but it goes up. And then antique cabinets like Pong and Space War, which is actually the first. Pong was not the first arcade game. Space War was. These were made in the early 70s and electronics break down. It's hard to find a cabinet that's working. It's an antique, literally. So
yeah, I mean the wood paneling kind of gives away that this is pretty old.
So the struggle here is to preserve media during that old period until it can reach the inflection point where people are more interested in preserving it, and then future generations can have it. So, game collecting. Though some games will increase in price, I wish I'd bought 1,000 copies of Earthbound about 15 years ago. Don't see it as an investment. Do it because you're a fan of a given system or era. I obviously, if you watch my show, I really like Super Nintendo. I'm very slowly and stupidly trying to go for a full collection. Well, that's because I love the system. It's one of my favorites ever, and I think it's a pinnacle of 2D gaming. If you want to preserve cultural heritage, if you are interested in preservation for future generations, maybe you're just a general historian, but you have a tiny bit of interest in video games. You're like, hey, yeah, maybe I could do something with that. And just because it's fun. Sometimes it's fun to go game chasing, trademark, or or something like that. You like to go out to flea markets at 7 in the morning for some stupid reason, on the chance you'll find that Flint stores at Dinosaur Peak for $5, right?
Yeah. And it's weird. I've actually talked to people that say, I'm not really into games. I just like the thrill of the hunt. And so it's not.
It's like a hobby.
Yeah, it's a hobby
for some people.
Yeah.
I mean, I can only take it so far, but we know of people who are kind of ridiculous about it.
A little crazy. Yeah.
Yes. Speaking of,
Yeah.
so tips on cleaning your own cartridges. Specifically speaking about cartridges here, NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, 64, stuff like that. We were actually discussing this because we're watching the Farewell Famicom Rider video last night, which was made in honor of Justin Jew Warrior Carmichael. And there was a line in there about how you can clean the contacts of a cartridge with rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip. And someone else says, no, you can't do that. Nintendo specifically says on the back of the cartridge that that'll damage the contacts. And they were having an argument about it. And I asked Norm, is that actually true? Because a lot of people use rubbing alcohol to clean contacts because that's the main, especially with NES games, that's the main problem when you get the flashing, bit on the screen. But a lot of people use rubbing alcohol to clean the contacts.
Yeah, Nintendo wanted to sell their cleaning kit to people, so they said, don't use this very common rubbing alcohol you can get for 90 cents in the store. You should buy our official cleaning kit. Go ahead.
That is true. Isopropyl, I believe, is a high...
I'm sorry. I'm using the term rubbing alcohol incorrectly. I just mean,
Isopropyl,
alcohol.
which is like 90% alcohol or something like that.
Yes.
And the reason why it's good is because you can clean the grime off a contact, but it evaporates very quickly, as opposed to water, which you definitely don't, or Windex, which you don't want to use.
Now, I will say, the NES pin connector, if you boil that, it works.
You mean the 72-pin connector in the NES?
No, you don't put the entire NES.
No.
You take the 72-pin connector and you boil it in, what's that water called?
Water?
No, you can't use tap water.
Hot water. Oh.
Distilled water.
Okay.
Yes. If you boil it in distilled water, I swear to God, it works. You'll look at the water; it's disgusting. All this dirt and grime will be in there. But yeah, you can boil the pin connector. I wouldn't do that with a cartridge because there's electronic chips and whatnot in there. But rubbing alcohol, not rubbing alcohol. I'm sorry.
Isopropyl
alcohol. Yeah.
That's perfectly fine with a Q-tip.
Yeah, fine with a Q-tip, and then you can actually take the other side of the Q-tip, wipe it off to get any excess residue off. I worked computer repair in high school for a few years, and even if somebody said I spilled coffee or soda on my laptop, we would literally just dump alcohol and let it sit for a day, and it would usually fix it. So yeah, in a white eraser, sometimes these contacts will get these black marks on there that are hard to get off, and a white eraser actually gets them off. You mean
an actual eraser, not magic eraser?
Not a magic eraser, specifically a white eraser. You don't want to get a pink one.
Yeah,
you don't use a pink one.
And that's something else. I actually did a video on cleaning old game cartridges. There's something called Mr. Clean. The brand name is Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. It's basically a melamine foam.
Great for Sharpies.
Yeah.
Sharpie marks on your...
Because it's almost impossible to get Sharpie marks out of a cartridge otherwise. But basically what it is, it's like a very, very fine-grained sandpaper. And it does take off a thin layer of the cartridge, basically.
It's worth it, though.
It's worth it, yeah. Off. If you go crazy with it, you'll notice it to get a little bit shiny. But if you're gentle, it's a great, great tool for cleaning cartridges. Sunlight is the natural enemy of the video game cartridge. in its natural habitat.
and manuals.
Yeah, I mean, if any of you have been out to flea markets, you've probably seen people with boxes of cartridges or whatever sitting out in the sun, and they're sun bleached, and that can happen after just a few weeks of that person taking it out. Really, it's sad. You want to save all the little games.
And I always see like game stores. They have like posters in their window, and they turn like this ugly, dull color.
Yeah, and that's something we didn't even talk about is video game merchandise, which is also usually put out in the storefront. Yeah, that's really susceptible to sunlight.
Amiibos, keep them in the box. Keep your Amiibos in the box.
But
was there a question over here? I thought I saw a white eraser. Huh?
Oh, you're. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, he was just asking about if the white eraser worked. We already addressed that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, definitely keep your question.
Pink.
So the question was why white eraser versus pink?
Pink will actually leave it's a little more rough than a white eraser. It'll actually leave a residue on there, and it kind of breaks apart when you're rubbing it on the contacts.
It's probably harder in my experience.
Much harder eraser.
So harder rubber.
Yeah, a white's a very delicate eraser that works much better and won't leave as much residue on the contact.
It's very delicate, like Norm.
Yes.
So yes, avoid sunlight and try to keep your case, not just your games, but your cases and your manuals as well, out of the sunlight and in a kind of a temperature controlled environment if you can help it. Sticking it out in the garage, I mean, it might not be for years and years. It might not be in the sunlight, but that's not the best temperature controlled environment.
Yeah, and even those like dust covers for games, I think those help tremendously.
Which, I mean, yes, it's a joke to put Pat in this picture, but there was a real reason. If you'll notice, he keeps his collection in...
He's got boxes and then plastic surrounding the box.
Yeah, these are plastic...
Total preservation.
Game box protectors. You can find them on Amazon or eBay. They're relatively cheap. If you have a collection of especially boxed games that you want to keep safe on the shelf, I haven't done this and I need to, you can get just a bunch of them for relatively cheap. I can't remember the cost off the top of my head, but it's definitely a good idea.
Now, Pat was going to freeze these games, right?
Yes, in carbonite.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. He's going to freeze them.
But also saying that having the original box or case is huge for preservation, especially the old cardboard boxes that Nintendo would put games in. I mean, how many of us, when we were kids, when we'd get an NES or Super Nintendo box or whatever, we'd be like, oh boy, a game! Rip up the box, throw it out, and we're like, I got the game, yay! And then 20 years later, you're like, oh, complete, it's $500. So it's not so much you can do right now to save those boxes that were thrown around like 20 years ago, but if you're starting out, especially with newer systems, it's a little bit easier with newer systems with the physical media because, they're functional. They're not just cardboard.
Yeah, and even speaking not only as like, oh, this makes the game more valuable, like there's some cool stuff in these manuals and boxes and that came with the game. I mean, some of these manuals have like original artwork that you would never see anywhere else.
Yeah, that's very true. Especially some of these old RPGs with huge, thick manuals when Nintendo was like, come on, North America, get an RPG.
Let me teach you how to play an RPG.
Here's an issue that is talked about a lot on forums that I hope might be good to address is disk rot. So this is an actual thing. Excuse me. But it's not what a lot of people think it is. It's basically something that's trapped. So the way a CD works is that you have a reflective layer that the laser can bounce off of, and there's like a clear plastic coating on the top that protects that layer. Sometimes during the pressing, especially earlier CDs, meaning earlier games, like this is a big problem with laser discs and maybe like early CDI games and stuff like that. But if there's an imperfection or some air trapped inside after time, that can oxidize and that can kind of ruin that part of the game, and basically cause little imperfections. I can see to the left here. That's holding up a disc to the light, and you can see
see through the disc.
You can actually see a hole. To the right is kind of like a warping. That's more of an issue at the factory when it was pressed. So games in general will still work if you have that. So don't freak out if you go home and like your your copy of Link Faces of Evil has disk rot, it'll probably still play, but it's something to kind of note. You know, maybe if you're looking at that, you should be like, oh, I should try to keep it in a better environment or something like that. I mean, there's no way to really prevent it, but it will eventually, could eventually be an issue.
Yeah, and I want to mention disk resurfacing for a second, because
when you get scratches on the disc.
Yes, anybody that's bought in a game from GameStop, I'm sure has experienced a completely scratched disc, even maybe a new game. If you take it to a store and they have a good resurfacing machine, it actually does work very well. I mean, there's some cheap resurfacing machines that, you know, it's going to look exactly the same when it pops out, but if you can find a store that has a good one, it's worth getting a disc resurfaced.
So, and what that does is basically, if you have a scratched disc, it takes off the top layer of the like either acrylic, I can't remember, or plastic coating, and leaves a clean surface so that the laser's not bouncing off of the protective layer. Right? Okay. More pictures of disk rot. So to the right, you'll see an example of what disk rot can do. It doesn't necessarily ruin a game, but it could cause problems with video in particular.
Okay, I gotta hear this.
I can believe that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So
buff out the scratch.
The comment, if you didn't catch it, was about using really cheap peanut butter, quote, a direct quote, and just kind of rubbing it in on a game and using a coffee filter to wipe it off. And car wax should work better, but it's more expensive than cheap peanut butter.
So Peter Pan, ladies and gentlemen, will solve your disc farm.
And I was going to say, actually, I've heard of toothpaste also being used. And what that does is that it kind of fills in the cracks. It's clear, like the oils, essentially, like the oils in the peanut butter. It's clear enough to still allow light to pass through. I don't know if I would recommend it. You can try it. I haven't tried it myself, so I can't say for sure if it works or if it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so the toothpaste is a fine abrasive. That makes sense. Yeah. So the car wax and the peanut butter will fill in the scratches, and the toothpaste will basically buff it out.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Question. Oh, definitely eat the peanut butter afterwards, and you can taste the sadness of Mario from the Hotel Mario disc.
You could probably lick it directly off the disc, like
Yeah.
if you just wanted to scoop it out with the disc.
So again, with cartridges, the best things to do in this instance are to just keep them out of sunlight, and particularly ultraviolet radiation, which there's a lot of in sunlight. In the back? Sorry.
Yep.
And that's an excellent point, is that there's a protective layer on the bottom of the disc, but not so much on the top. There's just basically a label, which is thinner. And that's why when games like this have disc rot, you can see through, because there's actually a hole usually in the label itself. And that is from a scratch or something like that. So just in general, be careful with your discs. I think this is something we all learned from an early age, but yeah, I don't know. Some people didn't. I've seen some really terrible games or terrible condition games out there for sale.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. How is it cleaned? Huh.
Resurfacing. I see. I mean, resurfacing is not guaranteed to fix a game.
Yeah, that's... And you can't see anything? That is...
Well, then we have a gaming mystery.
Yes. I like it's people helping people.
Yeah.
That's getting expensive too.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. If anything else, if all else fails, it doesn't hurt to try cheap peanut butter and toothpaste. Though probably not at the same time.
Yeah, try the peanut butter.
Yeah, but I mean, if there's not even any scratches in the coating, then that's difficult. Okay, and a little bit more about data degradation. Oh, here's what I was talking about before. You have your substrate, your top coat, etc. Moving on. Okay, sorry. This is an issue for mostly prototype carts.
Which you have one.
I
Joe.
do have a
Yeah.
prototype. Do you have a prototype cart, Norman?
No.
Oh, that's sad. So, like, I have an Earthbound prototype cart for the NES, and these are generally made with EEPROMs, which are erasable, programmable, read-only memory, as opposed to just read-only memory, which is what normal cartridges use to store data. You see that little window there? That's basically something that can erase the data if exposed to ultraviolet light. And it's just generally not as stable as read-only memory. So most data sheets for EEPROMs specify about a 10-year guaranteed life. That's just guaranteed. So if you have an NES prototype cart, that doesn't necessarily mean it's about to fall apart. It just means you should start taking steps to preserve it. And what will happen is that you'll have data leakage. Every once in a while, a stray ray might come in and erase a bit of data, and eventually, if that happens enough, it'll basically delete it. So the best thing to do in this instance, and I've done this, is to get a EEPROM reader. People sell NESs, for example, with a USB hookup that you put the cartridge in and you hook it up to your computer, run a program, and it will literally copy the data off the EEPROM. You can save it, make multiple copies to make sure it's not there's no problems in the transfer. And then if something horrible happens one day and you put in your cartridge and it won't work, you can just rewrite the EEPROM. This minimum 10 years of guaranteed programming lifetime is just for a program that is sitting on the EEPROM. The EEPROM will still work for a long time. It's solid state technology. It's very robust. You can rewrite on it, unless something horrible happens, you crack it or whatever. So all is not lost if the data on your prototype cartridge starts to fade. You can rewrite it. That's okay. It'll still work for another 10 years plus. So something to note, because I know prototype collecting is becoming more of a big thing. Norm needs to get on that.
Yep.
Cartridge lifetime.
Speaking of leaks, capacitors.
So the biggest issue you'll probably find, if you have a cartridge and you plug it in and you try everything, you try cleaning it, you try putting peanut butter and jelly on it, it doesn't work. The most likely problem is the capacitor lifetime, and I know this is a problem not just on game cartridges, but I know the Sega Game Gear in particular had a.
Oh yeah.
Norm, you probably know more about that.
Yeah, I've never come across a Game Gear today that just works.
Yeah.
And the problem was when the Game Gears were made, there was a big batch of bad capacitors that Sega used. So a lot of them just blew out. You have to replace the capacitors in the Game Gear. If you have a Game Gear that you bought today and it works without any repairs, then you are extremely lucky.
Yeah. So in general, and this is something in general to kind of recall, if you're at all handy with a soldering iron or something like that, you can just replace it's worth a shot to replace the capacitor and see if it works.
Yeah, there's a really good video tutorial online on how to do this.
Unsurprisingly.
Yeah.
I mean something, and this is not just in video games. For example, I work in LED lighting in my normal job, and any LED light bulb, for example, that you buy, it's like guaranteed for, I don't know, it may be guaranteed for 10 years and be projected to last for 22. And it's not like it's not like the LEDs break. Those are, again, very robust technology. Yes, they will dim over time, but LEDs generally just don't break. What breaks is the capacitor in the driver that converts alternating current to direct current. And that's when an LED bulb dies, that's usually what happens. So Something to keep out for if you're interested in electronics. Just in general, capacitors are always an issue. In the back?
Okay. So yeah, so the gentleman in the back says not only the Game Gear has this capacitor problem, but the Turbo Express may even be worse, which I would definitely believe.
That makes sense. It's all the same time frame. Yeah.
Yep,
So
that makes sense.
that's something that, especially if you're having a problem with a Game Gear or something like that, you can check, back in history because a lot of people have that same problem. It's probably a systematic error with the capacitors that came from a factory. I mean, there's a big problem. We were just talking about disc rot. Laser discs, early laser discs, were like mostly all pressed at this one factory in Ohio or something like that in the 80s, and they had a systematic error where air would get trapped in between the layer and cause disc rot, and you'd have laser discs failing all the time. So never rule out that it's just a systematic error that might need to be fixed. Battery leakage. I know that this has been an issue with a lot of Game Boy Pokemon cartridges.
Pokemon, yeah.
If you have a Pokemon cartridge, like Pokemon Blue or Silver, I think.
Well, it's gold
and Silver is particularly bad.
Red and Blue didn't use a battery, I believe.
Yeah, it did. How are you supposed to save your game?
I thought Gold and Silver, it had to have the battery because of the time of day. You had to save the time of day.
But where does it save the game? I'll fight you.
You probably know more about this than me, so you know more about this than me. So I'm gonna leave it to you. But.
Yeah, it's a battery backup, so it would have to. But anyway. The point is that if you have a battery in a cartridge and that cartridge is 10, 20 years old, even if the cartridge works, you might want to consider replacing the battery. If you're handy with electronics, you can try to put a power supply on it so that you don't lose your safe or your saves. Yeah. Oh, but just replacing the battery is a good idea. I mean, I think we've all had some form of electronics with batteries in it that maybe they sat for a while and all of a sudden it's not working. You open it up and the battery leaked and the acid got out and corroded everything. And that's just, you want to avoid that, especially with some of your more expensive cartridges like Earthbound or Chrono Trigger, et cetera, et cetera. Yes.
Like a car? Kind of like a car?
So the question was, this is Aladdin, you said?
Aladdin on the Super Nintendo, he claimed if you leave the game on, it'll recharge the battery.
I have never heard of that. Yeah, so wait, did you try that and it worked? Or you just kind of... Huh. I've never heard of that happening. That seems like it would totally be something made up on the playground. But...
Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting question. I want to look into that more.
We'll try it.
I can't say for sure. I've never heard of that being a solution. In general, though, like with a car battery that dies, you can boot it, not boot it. Sorry, you can
boot up the battery.
You can boot up the battery. Yeah. What is that called?
Jumping.
Thank you, jumping.
Yep.
You can jump the battery and then drive it around for a little while, and it'll charge it back up. But the problem, you still have the inherent problem of the battery. Just losing effectiveness over its lifetime. So it's still, even if the charging thing is true, it's still a good idea to change the battery on older cartridges. Yes. From what I understand, like with flashlights and stuff, you should like turn it on every once in a while to stop the batteries from leaking, gets the current flowing and stuff. So the question was, is that a good idea for cartridges as well? I don't think it could hurt. I mean, what's the hurt of pulling out Final Fantasy 3 every year or so and just giving it a whirl anyway, right?
Yep.
So I would
Doing
say
it for preservation purposes.
something else that is not common but can happen is solder joint corrosion. Especially if games are left in a bad environment, the solder joints will corrode and lose contact. Again, if you're handy with a soldering iron, you can fix that. Again, not common, something to look out for. That's a good point.
Yep.
Sometimes you don't even need to re-add solder. You just need to remelt it, reflow it, in other words.
It's a very good point.
We have, I think, like 5 minutes left, so we're going to go into a speed round. This is more stuff that doesn't really affect people at the home, but it's just other challenges with game preservation in general. Arcade game monitors use cathode ray tube televisions. Guess what isn't made anymore? I think the last company from what I understand, the last factory in China that made cathode ray tube TVs shut down like a year or so ago, maybe a few years ago.
Yeah, and you'd be hard pressed to find a TV repair.
Yeah, I mean, like
nowadays.
I have a cathode ray tube TV in my bedroom that I replaced with a flat screen just a couple weeks ago, and I don't want to throw out the CRT.
Yeah.
How else am I going to play Duck Hunt?
Yeah. I mean, I'm concerned about the Vectrex life here.
Funny you mentioned that, Norm.
Vector graphics. Yeah.
So even harder to fix than just regular cathode. If you want that real arcade experience, you can replace. There are kits to convert with flat screen monitors, but it's a little different for purists. Vector arcade machines like Asteroids, like Tempest, like Star Wars. Good point. Use a different type of monitor completely. That in cathode ray tube televisions, they have an electron beam gun normal ones, raster scans, what it's called. They have an electron beam gun that goes just back and forth and just paints a picture basically on the front of this monitor. Vector graphics literally have the gun point out a shape. And multiple shapes. That's why if you've ever played Asteroids, I haven't had a chance to look at the arcade room, but hopefully they have a copy so you can play it.
Yep.
I'm seeing nods. I love vector graphics. Vectrex is an awesome system. It's the only home vector graphics system.
Built in.
I think it came out in '82, but it's very crisp. It's great graphics, and it's very difficult to fix. No one really makes vector graphic arcade monitors anymore. So this is something that arcades in general have a really hard time fixing.
Yeah.
It's very specialized technology. Laserdiscs. For a while, Laserdisc games were not extinct, but very hard to come by. So on top of the normal problems with Laserdiscs, in the early '80s, games like Dragon's Lair and Space Ace came out. And you can argue the quality of the gameplay, but they were really interesting in original animation by Don Bluth, and really immersive at a time when most games looked like that, right? But think about it: you have a Laserdisc player, something that's meant to play a movie, a 2 or 3 hour movie, maybe once every few days. Instead, you have it running at least like 16 hours a day. Usually in the bottom of the cabinet where frustrated players will kick and jar it, and these things just did not last long. I think the average lifetime of a Laserdisc arcade game was maybe a year if you were lucky back in the day. And no one wanted to fix them. They were expensive and they were crap. They would just throw out the innards and move on. Around 2000, the first ever arcade Laserdisc emulator called codenamed Daphne came out. And basically what this is something to emulate Laserdisc games. If you play a Laserdisc game, again, I'm not sure exactly what's out here. There might be a Space Ace or a Dragon's Lair. It is, I am almost assured, to be emulated, which in this case is a necessity because these old Laserdisc players are super finicky and expensive and hard to come by. So there are positives to ROMs and emulation. Yes, and the team that made Daphne is working on another code named Dexter. These are both characters from the Don Bluth games, which is a hardware replacement. So if you actually have it's a more robust modern hardware replacement, so if you actually have the Laserdisc itself, you can put it in and it will spin it and it will not die on you after a few weeks. A very sad thing is game company involvement in video game preservation. In the 70s and the 80s, actually even today, a lot of game companies just are not thinking about it. There's an excellent series of articles where Games Go to Sleep by John Anderson, who wrote for Gamasutra in 2011, basically where he polled he reached out to a bunch of different game companies and asked, how important is it for game developers and publishers to preserve their video games for future audiences? IREM Software revealed it has no intact source code from the 1980s, but still maintains ROMs for almost all their games. Taito revealed that some of the promotional materials associated with their games have been lost forever. Digital Leisure revealed that the original source code to Dragon's Lair and Mad Dog McCree was lost or could not be accessed due to the media it was stored on. So, and this was a repeating story, is that these game companies didn't think about video game preservation. They were in the middle of creating these games in the 80s, and they're like, okay, that's out. What's the next big thing? Ignore that box over there. We got to move on to this. Throw it out. I don't care. Huh. That's fascinating. So search for CPS2 Phoenix on YouTube, and you'll get talks about these self-destructing hardware. Yeah, that's fascinating. Oh yeah,
Yep.
That's the Internet Archive.
Internet Archives,
Yeah.
which are archiving a bunch of MS-DOS games.
Yes, and that's the Internet Archive does a very good job. Actually, we'll talk about them in a minute. So, and the final note on this: seriously, take a screenshot of this and look up this article. It's an excellent piece of investigative journalism.
And I want to make one more point about game company and developers today. I read a recent article about developers concerned, specifically developers that make DLC content. And they're concerned about what's going to happen to the stuff that they make, years from now. Because think about it, if you got BioShock and you downloaded a DLC content for it, you can only get it on, downloading on the 360 or PS3, and years from now, what if that hard drive dies? Like, how do you access that content years from now? So that's why you're seeing a lot of these like Ultimate Edition BioShocks coming out, and the developers really like that because it preserves their DLC content forever.
Yeah, this is becoming more of a question that no one really has the answer to. So I gave a similar presentation at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo a few months ago. Someone asked a very good question about digital content. You don't have a physical disc even, so how is that preserved? The question is, we don't know. It's an ongoing question. Interestingly enough, though, about DLC, sometimes you see these like Game of the Year editions of like, I don't know, Red Dead Redemption or Grand Theft Auto 4, which has all the DLC. The problem is, as you see with this current generation, these game companies want to go more and more to digital-only distribution of games. So 5-10 years, will we even have physical media for video games on consoles even?
Yep.
One other note about game companies, just to punctuate the fact that this is an issue. Does anyone know when Super Mario Brothers was released in North America? Yeah, Nintendo doesn't either.
No one. There is no like official confirmed date of when that game.
Yeah, Frank Cifaldi, who is a very, very good and thorough internet video game historian, did a piece for Gama Sutra as well in 2012 called "Sad but True: We Can't Prove When Super Mario Brothers Came Out."
Yeah, it was a good article. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an excellent article. He talked to a lot of people, tried to find evidence
Found
of the
a bunch
release.
of newspaper clippings like now available, and he checked the date on the newspaper, and they were all different. Like every single.
I mean, so he was able to basically say it probably came out on November 17th, 1985. Probably, but that's about as far as you could get. So this brings us to organizations on the case. The Internet Archive is excellent. They put up a huge amount of old DOS games
that you can play for free in your browser,
which is awesome. Some work better than others. The ones from the early 80s work better than ones from the early 90s because it's in a browser. But definitely go to archive.org and check it out. They do excellent work. ACAM, which they usually have representatives here. I'm going to say that they're here, so you should go see them. That's the American Classic Arcade Museum in Weirs Beach, New Hampshire. If you've ever seen King of Kong, Fun Spot, they're basically at Fun Spot. So it's got like a section of Fun Spot specifically where they preserve these old arcade machines, and they do excellent, excellent work. Please donate to them if you can. Actually, if this is something I do, if you ever buy anything off of Amazon, no one does that, right? If you go to a website called smile.amazon.com, as opposed to just www.amazon.com, you can designate a charitable organization where a portion of the proceeds from that purchase will go to, which is awesome.
Yep.
So it doesn't cost you anything, and it can, if you buy, like me, a lot of stuff off of Amazon during the course of the year, that can help. And ACAM is one of the possible beneficiaries. So I do that. You can do it for any charity. So just in general, use smile.amazon.com if you buy something off of Amazon. But yeah, ACAM's great. The National Museum of Play is up in Rochester, New York. They, I believe, I don't want to tell a story that I don't know the answer to. I think it was started by a woman who just had a lot of collection of toys or something like that, and she donated to Rochester to open this museum. So it's not just video games, it's all sorts of toys and games and things like that spanning decades, but video games are a big part of the collection. They have some great, interesting articles up there, or not articles, but artifacts. I've never been there, but almost any time I see a new article on the internet talking about video game history and these video game journalists finding something new, they usually find it at the Museum of Play.
Should we mention pinball at all? Pinball games, or they're in Vegas. The Pinball Hall of Fame.
I didn't go see that. You did though.
I did, yeah. Basically, just a giant warehouse of pinball games, and you can play every single one of them.
And pinball is ridiculously
from the 20s
hard.
and 30s.
We didn't even
pinball machines.
I know, yeah. I don't know if you knew that pinball machines actually go back almost a century. It's ridiculous, and they're hard to keep upkeep, I should say. The Video Game History Museum is something that has been around for a few years, and they finally have designated a permanent home in Frisco, Texas. For a while, it was
Because they
just
used
a
to
traveling
go to,
exhibit.
Yeah, they used to travel all the conventions.
Yeah, but it's actually started by 3 very big collectors. Let me, say their names correctly. Sorry, Joe Santulli, John Hardy, and Sean Kelly. Basically, just 3 really big collectors that are like, hey, we should probably open up a museum, yay! And so they did, and they have some really amazing artifacts just to show the public. Joe Santulli, one of those 3, actually also runs Digital Press, which is both a physical shop and
Very good
online,
store.
and an online
Community.
collection
Yeah.
and community talking about old games and archiving information at Clifton,
It's in
New
New
Jersey.
Jersey.
I've never gone, but I wish I have
Great
to
store,
someday.
yeah. It's a great store.
There's also there's a couple more for you there.
Yep, the Video Game and Arcade Preservation Society. It's kind of a high-class organization. There's some pretty high membership qualifications, but they're dedicated to saving physical arcade cabinets as much as possible, repairing them, not trying to replace the boards or anything. And the Smithsonian recently opened up the art of video games. There is finally a section in the Smithsonian for video games, which is come a long way when you're in the Smithsonian.
Travel like 10 minutes north and go see it.
Yeah.
And also, viewers like you
Thank
help to keep things preserved.
Yep.
One last note: making
there's
internet
Pat again.
shows, because we have more. This is what you came for, is Pat. So,
Yeah.
making internet shows are helpful for keeping interest alive. That's part of what we do, why we do what we make. So, if you make internet shows, thank you. If you are interested in doing it, do it. It gets
Definitely.
things like Let's Plays and old retro game reviews get people interested and keep things alive. Earthbound was, yes, a cult hit 10 years ago, but it's not the very well-known phenomenon it basically is now.
I think internet shows had a lot to do with that.
It did. I think
Our buddy Derek.
Happy Video Game Nerd did a lot for that in particular. Gaming Historian, which is Norm's show, documents history for future generations. My show, 16-Bit Gems, highlights the forgotten games from that era. Thank you for coming. We are out of time. Here's where you can find us. We appreciate you sitting through our spiel. As a reward, if you would like, I have would you like to save your progress bookmarks with the beautiful Clan of the Grey Wolf logo on the back.
If you happen to read books,
please.
it's useful.
So please come up and take one. Have a great MAGFest.